Hi, in this video, I want to talk about prepping paper to hold paint. We're working with acrylic paint, but this could be used for oils as well. As an illustrator, I spent several years having to prepare paper or illustration board to hold paint because I didn't work on canvas, and the reason being is for scanning purposes. When you scan a painting, it picks up every little detail. And when you're doing illustration work or highly detailed paintings, you don't necessarily want the texture of canvas unless you're working with a really beautiful smooth canvas. You're going to want to maybe work with something of a smooth surface like paper or illustration board, or what I really love is wood panels or gesso prepared wood panels that you can buy in any art store, and I think you can order them through Michael's too. This is Bristol paper, so it's a little bit heavier than a regular paper or drawing paper or sketchbook paper, which you can actually prepare for painting as well. A lot of people, like to paint their sketchbooks and they'll just apply some gesso to the page before they paint on it. Same rule applies for this. There are different options for mediums that you can use. I could use a gesso on this whole page before I draw on top of it, but there's also clear mediums that you could use. As an illustrator, I typically used, I would have my image and I would use what's called matte medium. Matte medium is a clear liquid. It's an acrylic medium to prepare your surface, and it dries crystal clear, so your image shows through really nice. You can use this for a lot of other applications too, like collage, putting down cut out pieces. It's a lot of fun to work with. You can use gel medium, but it's a heavier body. It's really thick, so if you want to build up a surface layer that has some texture, this is really fun to use too, and you can get really heavy body mediums, and this also dries clear. And then what is my new favorite is clear gesso by Liquitex. This is the first time I've used this. I picked it up yesterday and I love it, because when I was using the matte medium, I found that I used gel medium. Either one, you get a little bit of warping. One thing, keep in mind, was working yesterday on another piece, and I had it taped off before I prepared it, and it warped quite a bit, and I tried working into it, and it was not fun. I had to put books on it to flatten it out. Like, you know what, I think I'm just going to do it without the tape, prepare the whole surface. You can see I have a border, just do the whole surface with the clear gesso, and this is how it dried, so it's pretty flat. So from this point, I have 3 layers on here too. It should be sealed. I have 3 layers. And how I did that was I just poured it on, and I used just a regular old house painting brush that has really soft bristles. And then I have another brush. These are all very soft. You can also use a foam roller that you could just get at any hardware store. And that is those are great because you get a nice even texture. With this, when you spread it out, you have to kind of keep going over it until it starts to get a little bit tacky, and you soften out the texture. You're going to have a little bit of texture as it dries, but it levels. It's a self-leveling medium, so it leaves a little bit of a tooth. You may like the tooth, you may not. A method I learned years ago to get a really nice eggshell surface for painting on was using paint sandpaper. This is for actually working on paint and just lightly sanding it. You don't have to do very much, and that just gets rid of that little bit of texture and leaves it really smooth. So you can run your hand over it. I'm more concerned about the image than the border at this point. And with 3 layers, this should be sealed. You can do more layers. I know of artists that do up to 7 or 8 layers and sand in between every coat, which I did. I sanded in between every coat really light, did another layer, and it has this really nice finish to it. So that's how you would prepare your paper. The next thing is I'm working with acrylic paint, and I think the same rule applies if you're working with oil paint, is you want to get some kind of ground cover. It's another layer to seal it, but working with color, especially with acrylics, you know, you're going to work in layers. You're not going to get the coverage that you want to see in one shot, in one layer. It just doesn't happen. The white of the paper shows through, it gets really streaky. So you're going to have multiple layers. Typically, rule of thumb, 3 to 4 layers. The first one being just a really nice thin ground cover, like wet blend kind of thing, maybe working with a little bit of water. The second coat is basically to just go back over it again and cover up any streakiness or where the white shows through and start maybe working on some detail. Third layer is where you're really honing in on maybe texture, detail, cleaning up any areas that you want to clean up, playing with the color, changing anything that you want to change. And a fourth layer would be maybe refining your edge work or playing with, you know, smaller details. Basically, it's working from the background forward, big to small. So big shapes, very broad, very thin, to working forward with smaller shape, smaller detail, and maybe a little bit thicker paint. So as you build the layers, the painting gets better and better. One thing that beginners face when they're learning how to paint, especially with acrylic, because it's not an easy medium to learn how to paint with, is they get very discouraged right in the beginning because the painting doesn't look good. It's very streaky and the color is not acting the way they want it to act, and it's not moving very well across the surface. It's okay, because you're not going to do it in one layer. You should be building on those layers, and it's paint. If you make a mistake, you paint over it. It's very forgiving. Acrylic dries very fast, but there are mediums that you can use, flow mediums, to slow down the drying time to make it act actually a little bit more like oil paints. I don't actually have any out right now, but that's a really great way to extend the drying time of acrylic paint. You can also use a little bit of water, but warning, don't use too much water, because when you use too much water, it actually breaks down the molecular structure of the paint and weakens it. So you want to be careful with that, because what could happen is it could end up cracking, it could end up flaking off. Longevity isn't as strong. So you can mist lightly, you can definitely keep some water, you know, going with your acrylics, but just don't overdo it. You're better off working with a flow medium. You could work, I think, you know, matte medium you could probably use as well too. It's an acrylic extender, which actually says right here. So if you were working with matte medium to cover the surface, you could work with this in your acrylic as well. But there's actually fluid mediums that are specifically for that. Anyways, I'm just working with a really simple image to kind of demonstrate. It's a location in the Highlands of Scotland, which I love, and it's a castle. Sort of. It's not fully drawn out yet, but I can refine that later. Right now, I just want to work on maybe a really light wet blend in the sky and start blocking in some color. So I'm working with, on this piece, complementary colors, possibly veering into split complements. So complementary colors are any color opposite each other on the color wheel. So like orange and blue, blue, green, red, orange. So that is actually, those are the colors I'm going to be working with. Yes, that means I have to mix more color. I work with a limited palette. I use my primary colors and I add a few others, maybe a couple shades of blue, couple shades of red, and my white and my black, and sometimes green, and magenta is a great color to add into your color palette. If I go split complement at all, that means if I'm working with, say, orange and blue, I can split across and I can use these three. And I could go the opposite way. It keeps it in that complementary color family without veering into, say, violets and red and the greens and yellows. So you can see right there, that would be as far as I would push it using any kind of complementary colors. Most of this, I'm going to create kind of a sunset feel, and I want to do a gradient from light, warm to cooler. So it'll go from like orangey colors up to more of a greenish blue up here. And then down here, I'm going to have variations of blue-green mostly. And the castle is going to have that red-orange, and it's going to be reflecting into here. So to start, you can use a misting bottle, or you could get one of those really little ones at in the travel section of practically any grocery store or department store. Those work great because they're small. And you can lightly mist your surface, but you can also use it for other things. I have my paint over here on paper towel that's actually dried out because this was from yesterday. But to keep your paint on your palette wet, you can continually mist them. Not too much so that they don't get all runny and everything, but you know. To do this, I can mist it, but then sometimes what might happen is you get this weird texture from the droplets. So instead, I'm going to just brush a thin layer of water on here. A couple hints, suggestions. When you are cleaning out your brushes or you're done using one brush, don't leave it in the water. Just clean it, dab it out, set it to the side. The reason being is the bristles that go up into here, that can start breaking down the glue. And also you get that when they're like this, your bristles will start fraying, and you really don't want to be doing that. Okay, so I'm just gonna lay a thin layer. Oh, shoot. I almost forgot. Before I start painting on here, I want to tape off my edges, my border. Otherwise, I'm going to have it all into my border. Just using blue painter's tape. A good rule of thumb, so it doesn't get too sticky and then risk pulling up the paper when you pull up the tape, is before you put it on, just get rid of some of the stickiness on a piece of clothing, like your jeans or your t-shirt or something like that, and then put it down. And then around your edges, kind of use your fingers to burnish it so it's really locked down. All right, now I'm going to start laying in some water. Not a lot, don't need a lot. Just a really thin layer. I'm just going to go down to this part because I'm working with the sky, but I want to make sure if it blends into the hills, it's fine. So I am using a light orange to a green. So I'm going to try and do a wet blend. That is from a nice orange. When you're mixing orange, I always start with yellow because the red pigment will be very strong. I'm also using different brands of paint, so they can blend well, but they don't always operate the same depending on the pigment in the paint. Some are better than others. So you may have certain preferences as to what kind that you like. So I have an orange mixed up, and I'm gonna put it in my white because I want it to be pretty light. One thing about acrylics to remember is, unlike oils, acrylics dry darker than what you see when they are wet. So you want to be really careful about laying it down too dark. When I was learning how to paint with acrylics years ago, I'm a muralist, and I would always start too dark, and it would drive me crazy because then I would have to constantly go back into it with so many layers, lightening everything up. So you're better off starting a little bit lighter than maybe you want to go eventually. Okay, so I have like a light blue green and I have a light orange, and we're going to try that. My brush, you don't want it to be dry, you want it to be a little bit wet, but again, oh shoot, I got my orange. You don't have to be dunking it, so just a little bit on your brush and start laying in. If this starts drying too fast, you can always lay down more. You want to make sure that this is not dry. I might just miss. Really light, because I've already got paint down. Just work really fast. Remember, I'm just toning my paper. I'm not applying it thick. Not saying that you can't apply it thick right away, but if I want to get some kind of direction in my, where I want my colors, and I want to play with some of these really light wet blends where I actually want some of that, white of the paper to show through. It's really yellow, so I'm going to actually push more of my orange, a little bit more. So I'm kind of looking at like if the sun had just gone down. Oops, where's my red? Like I said, that little splooge, don't worry about it. It's just paint, because I will, in this area where it's really light, I will be going in with more layers. I'm just going to go all the way up. So you can do this kind of blending, really nicely, as long as you're working with a damp surface. It's like watercolor. I'm just blocking in. You could work with more paint, thicker paint, and apply it, in one area, and then as one area is wet, you start another color, and then work wet into wet that way, which is another way of mixing your paint right on your piece. I'm not going to have a lot of the blue. And if it starts getting streaky, I can go in this other direction. And for now, that's enough. In a second layer, I can definitely go back over it. If I don't like it, I can go into it again. That's not a problem. Okay, so now atmospheric perspective and light at this time of the day. As things go back, they take on a bluer tone and they get cooler than things in the foreground. They also have less contrast, so it would really be soft against that sky, and then as things come closer, there would be a richer color, a little bit darker, and more contrast. I am going to just be working with my blue-green hill because I want to be colorful. And I'm letting it go into the background a little bit to create just a nice soft edge to set it up. Again, later I can go in, I can adjust it with more layers of paint. And then as I come forward, I'm going to get a little bit brighter, or not brighter, but more saturated with this hill that's in the front. And I want to keep things, I don't want it soaking wet, just really lightly misted. Now, if I had not prepared the paper and I'm trying to do this, the paper would have just soaked it right up. So you don't want that. Oops. I have no idea what that is. Sometimes you just get stuff on your brush. Don't panic. You always have to remind yourself, it's the first layer. It doesn't need to be perfect. This is definitely going to have another layer in it. If you want to tone your color down, there are two options. You could use like a mid-tone gray, mix a little bit of that into your color, or you could mix the complement of whatever you're using. So for my blue-green, if I wanted to tone it down, which means just make it a little more neutralized, so it's not so saturated with color and so bright, I could add a little bit of the orange or the orange red. So that's one thing I'm going to do, and you can see here on my palette maybe. When you mix it, it's a much more, if I wanted to do it here, it's just, it neutralizes it a little bit. And I'm working with a big brush because I'm not really concerned about detail yet. And you also see I am mixing right on my palette. Typically when I am grabbing from my pure colors, I would use a palette knife and mix, but sometimes just mixing with your brush around here, it gives you more control. It's more immediate, it's quicker, and you use less paint because then I'm not always grabbing so much. I can just grab it with the corner of my brush and work that way. I'm gonna get it a little more liquefied. I could start building up like in the foreground if I want it to be a little bit darker than at the top. I can start playing with that. This is part of the castle, so I'm not going to go into that. If it's very brushy, don't worry about that. I'm using this dark teal color that I really like, and I'm just going to really lightly go in to the foreground, into the water. I have reflections that I'm going to do in a second layer. But this just lets me work quickly, just to block in some color. If I go into the castle, it's fine. I'm not losing my drawing because the color is very transparent. So I'm not worried about that. It's the thing when you're learning how to work with acrylic, just don't worry. Because in the end, if you just reassure yourself, you can keep going back into it until you get what you want. Don't give up. Just keep working on it. And I always tell my students that they should never hold their work really precious, because as they're learning, they're going to make mistakes. I make mistakes. I'm still learning. It's not all going to be, exactly how you want all the time. And it's okay. You could ditch it and be like, I'm done. I'm not going to keep working on this anymore. Or you could just put it away for a while, and just let it sit and take a breather, and then come back to it in a day or two. I also tell them, don't wait to the last minute. If they have a deadline, you need to kind of spread out your time, because trying to do this all in one sitting is never going to be very much fun, because it can get kind of tiring. And you start making mistakes, you're just like, I don't want to work on it anymore. You're better to just put it away for a while, not look at it, and then come back to it later. I have like reflections, so the water is going to be very still, and I will be going in with some tones, so even maybe darker than this. I have to figure out like where my water line is, right in here. And I'm just gonna do a little bit for my castle to block that in. So that's gonna be the red orange. And I have a light side. So I'm kind of, it's atmospheric light. I don't have direct light on it. So I'm choosing to have like a glow as if it's all the way around. So I'm gonna hit lights here, and then I'm gonna let this be my light side and this be more of the shadow side. So for this side, I'm going with just kind of a light red orange, and it will probably end up being even lighter than that. I have some towers I need to draw out. When you work like this too, it's so thin, the drawing shows through, you can actually draw on top of this when it's dry, if you wanted to add stuff. That's always nice. Okay. I'm going to be able to turn. I have a flat. I'm working with a flat. So speaking of brushes, there's a few brushes that, other than this nice flat one, and see, I just left it in the water. Don't do that. Make sure you just clean it and take it out. So one like this is really nice. And then this is a 1/2 inch. This is a 1/4 inch. Okay, couple flats, a small round or a liner brush that would be even longer, and maybe a nice, this one's a little frayed, I need to fix it. And I'm gonna do a video on fixing your brushes. See, when it's really frayed, there's a way to fix that. A nice filbert is really good too. But flats, you have a nice, well, this is not the best edge, but when you have a nice clean edge on it, you can use that for any of your straights and just work right up to it. Now again, I'm not worried about perfect edges. I'm gonna go back into that when I go back into it, because this is gonna have like little windows and all that. When I go back into it, I'm gonna tone this down a little bit with my complementary color. Oops. And I'm just mixing right on my palette. And one thing that can happen when you mix complementaries, if you're doing it evenly, you can create mud really fast. So if that starts happening, like I just threw in more yellow. If I'm working with the orange to kind of bring it back, and that just tones it down. Has a little bit of a green tinge to it because I've got the complementary color in it. A little muddy, but I'm going to be going back over it. When you go into final layers and you really want to tighten up, and I will be demonstrating this in the next video, you can use, I would work on this probably vertically, or at least figure out an angle so that I'm not straining my neck so much, and what's called a mull stick. So this gadget is actually a Swiffer handle that I use for my big paintings, and has a handle, and on the end, this is falling apart, but putting sand in here to rest against your work, and then it's used to just rest your hand like this so that you can do detail, but when you're working vertically. If you're working like this, you can take a clean brush and just, maybe not on your painting, but off to the side, something to just rest your hand. Make sure the area where your hand is dry. You can just, it gives you a little more control. Because when you're just trying to balance, you're gonna get a little shaky. Getting a little dark in here, but I just want to get a ground cover. I'll go back into it later. And then I'm going to do the same thing, but lighter. Don't want it to be, because it's going to take on colors of blue. So I'm going to do a very transparent layer here, because some of the water is going to be going across it and some of those blue tones. This video is definitely meant for the beginner. Unless you've never prepared actual paper for painting, then maybe, that's something that you haven't done before. But this is working out really well. It's holding the paint pretty nice. Oops, wrong side. I'm just gonna remember that. This side is light. And I'm just blocking in. There's no detail. That's it. I'm gonna go back in later with more definite shape, maybe gradations for water reflections and things like that. But that's basically it for prepping your paper and laying down a tone, blocking in some color to get ready for your next layers to hold the paint really nice. It just makes everything so much easier when you really go into painting. And that's it. Thank you for listening.